This is my favorite comment this week, and it's from Z Kangs 932. And it says, what I'm most interested about is how the different black African groups interacted with one another during the times of the pharaohs. From what I'm seeing, ancient Egypt was some sort of ancient, super powerful black civilization that took from every major black culture during its time, and its strategic position with the Nile River as a magnet just further proves it. From Kemetic artifacts, it seems they were Cushitic looking people, Medjay, Bantu looking people, 18th dynasty royals, and the very dark, tall Sudanic type of people, the 25th dynasty, and other paintings. Ancient Egypt was extraordinary and really one of a kind. I hope that we may recreate that greatness for our people, especially as it seems the AES will be the anchor and focal point for the modern African unity this century. What a time to be black. So here's my opinion of the history of what you were talking about. So you said that it's multiple African civilizations that came together to create a fusion state that became bigger than any other. And I don't think that anybody would actually argue with you. I actually saw a documentary the other day that came out about ancient Egypt, and I think they said something very similar to that. What I believe is that that is exactly what happened. As we can see, multiple versions of things that come from ancient Egypt end up all over Africa. Now, obviously, there is some cutoff period because, of course, there is metal in West Africa that does not exist in Egypt until later. So there's some cutoff point where Egypt takes its own identity and becomes its own thing. Now, remember, I made a bunch of videos about this long time ago where I showed you that stick fighting existed in that one location. And as you can see, with several different nations around Africa, they all practice this version of stick fighting. That is why in West Africa, you find the Tuareg and people like that fighting swords as if they are sticks, rather than fighting swords the way that you generally fight them because they picked it up from other Africans. Of course, there's the Afro-Asiatic languages, which I've talked about 100 times. I do not need to go into it. And there is also the fact that the people located in Egypt are literally in Africa. Who are the people that affected them? Well, based on writing, it's pretty obvious. It's the East African tribes. So, who are the East African tribes? Well, one of them would be those located in Ethiopia, the other ones would be those located in Sudan, and the other ones would be those located in Northeast Africa, like Libya, the area of Kanem, Bornu. Remember that I told you about? These places have been written about by the ancient Egyptians for thousands of years, and they have been part of the history of ancient Egypt forever, and a lot of them were allowed to exist within ancient Egypt. So, how do we know that they affected the civilization? Well, it's because they write it in their books. They write about long time ago how they used to live and how they live now, about how the tumulus became ancient tombs, and then these tombs became pyramids. I think that we think that ancient Egyptians were very different than other Africans simply because their civilization has giant pyramids and writing. But this is very small distinction compared to everything else they did. I mean, remember the way the ancient Egyptians wore clothes. The morality behind clothing for both men and women in ancient Egypt was similar or the same as that in other parts of Africa. And of course, the reason why it's probably the same is because they don't have a lot of outside inspiration until they get a lot of outside inspiration, which you do start seeing the change in styles of clothing based on outsiders very late in its history. Now, I want to talk about one thing in ancient Egypt, which is also very, very similar to what you see everywhere else in Africa. And it's this, the gods, the gods of ancient Egypt, which are animals, which, if you look at the Dogon, if you look at the Mali Empire, if you look at the Kingdom of Ghana, if you look all over Africa, you will see similar thing. Masked up humans and animal worship. And then, of course, ancestral worship. And these animals, again, are manifestations in real life. That's the consideration of these people. So when you look at this dog-like creature, you're not looking at people who the ancient Egyptians think looks cool in a mask. You're looking at someone they think literally looks like this. Well, literally looks like a dog, but this could be one of these manifestations. And this is one of the things that rules out Asia as a foundation for ancient Egypt, because Asia, at least the parts of Asia that we know about, had already reached different stages in their history, especially the type of civilizations that could have given birth to ancient Egypt, like the Sumerians. Remember, ancient Egyptian history or ancient Egyptian religion is completely unrelated to Sumerian history. Not only is it unrelated, but it's not even interestingly related. So, in other words, if you take a look at their gods, right, you can see that there's nothing similar until you get to the Akkadians, when the Akkadians start stealing some ideas from outside areas. When Egypt died, it also took a lot of its concepts with itself. But these concepts, when they were first in their formation, clearly resemble those of other parts of Africa. Now, of course, like I said, ancient Egypt has a lot of very unique things going on within the country. So, if the question is, and this is a case of multiculturalism, if Egypt became the greatest kingdom, the greatest civilization, the greatest religious hotspot, the greatest influence to ever exist in the world, and it was located in Africa, and it has no signs that any of its traditions, early traditions especially, evolve from any other place besides Africa, then we know that almost all of its traditions must have been inspired by the huge number of groups that come in. Now, the breakdown you gave was interesting, the Bantu and the whatever, but I think it actually goes deeper than this. I obviously know that people from West Africa made their way into North Africa. So, from that direction, we don't even need the DNA that came later, even though we have it. Again, if you look at places like Kanem, which are right next to Egypt, they're in Libya, and that area of Libya was well explored by the ancient Egyptians. You see, one of the things that the ancient Egyptians had were names for their surrounding areas. And I have shown several times that from going back 2500 BC, they had names for Africans located all over their territory. And I've also read several times documents that document how those civilizations changed those nations. One of the ways that they changed it was a lot of these people were used as first installments of civilization. So if someone ran into Egypt, they would run into these people, the Lebu and the Tenahu. But first, these people were called the Mashwesh. Now, the Mashwesh are only one Libyan tribe, and they do not represent the majority of them in any way, shape, or form. If you go read about the other Libyan tribes, they're very different from the Mashwesh. But again, purely African, another direction. And people forget that Egypt is surrounded by African countries. And then on the other side, when you get to Asia, there's only one little string that leads into Asia. And it first starts with the Arabian areas. So Saudi Arabia and Yemen and those places. Possibly, One of the things that people don't talk about a lot is language. And I've never really spoken about how deep the languages are in the Berbers because there is a problem, of course. Arabic took over, destroying a lot of the Berber connections. But, let's rewind our brain. Look at how large the domain of the Berber languages is, as just as a whole. Now, I want you to keep in mind in your brain, keep this in mind. And I want you to start to think about what I'm saying in a very different way than what you would have thought about it before. So we start with the ancient Egyptian language, which is the Afro-Asiatic language. We all know that. If ancient Egyptian is Afro-Asiatic, and it is, then what does that mean? Well, it means that it's one of the, not one, it's the oldest written language with a continuous group till today. I'll say it again. It's the oldest group with a continuous written language till today. So what does that mean? Again, it means it must have started somewhere in Africa prior to writing, before writing. Why? Why would we say this? Why would we say this language starts before writing? Well, so let's look at Libya, Mali, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Mauritania. We find the language there. And they've probably been in these locations for thousands of years. You know what the ancient Egyptians said they saw when the Libyans came for them? In fact, there's a page, if I find it, I'll put it in, where the person who is going after the Nubians and is going after the Libyans says, I crushed the cities of Nubia and I burned the tents of Libya. When Ibn Battuta and the Portuguese got to Mauritania, what did the Berbers have? Tents. Now, this large culture that goes from Egypt all the way to Mauritania tells us one thing. So, from the border of Egypt all the way to Mauritania, they have this one culture. What does that tell us? It tells us that African culture can be spread and language can be spread over very large distances. And not only can it be spread via large distances, but those similarities can be kept up for a pretty long time. Now, there were breaks in there. Of course, there are some civilizations that we're finding today that go back to 2000 BC, as high as in Morocco and places like that, which is interesting. You see, something in Egypt happens that's actually very, very unique, which is that even though ancient Egypt is very patriarchal in its foundation, it's also very matrilineal in its inheritance. So a lot of things are inherited through the woman. And I read you the people talking about the kingdom of Ghana, the kingdom of Mali. Ibn Battuta even said this. He said that wealth is inherited through the mother or the mother's sister's child, the mother's child. So it's actually, or the aunt's child. That can happen in that way too. Now, if we go and look in here, we can see cultural patterns in some societies. Membership was and followed list still is shown in italic inherited maternally. Example include many, if not most, Native North American groups. So we see in American groups, which I can easily show you, but I don't think you guys will disbelieve me. I can easily show you that not African American, American groups inherited or lived matrilineally. This is why they were very egalitarian in their thinking. And this is cool for them But remember, that's so far away that it has nothing to do. Now, in the south parts of Polynesia, we also see matrilineality existing in those regions. But one place where matrilineal is throughout the entire continent as well, just like the Americas, is Africa. And so you can see there, it's like including the Ashanti, the Bono, the Akwome, the Fente of Ghana, most groups across the so called matrilineal belt of South Central Africa, the Nubians of Southern Egypt, the Sudan, the Tuareg of West and North Africa, and Serer, Senegal, the Gambia, Mauritania. The title of the Rain Queen in South Africa is inherited via matrilineal primogeniture. Dynastic descent is maternally with only females eligible to inherit. So the female is put up on high. And remember, in ancient Egypt, they used to paint the female yellow to show that she is divine compared to the man. Now, this was not to suck up to females, they just didn't know any better. That's the culture. The culture is females are divine, so therefore certain things must be passed through them. And the way the society worked is very different than what you would imagine if this was the case, but still, that was the thought behind all of these civilizations in Africa, starting from Egypt all the way down. So, off of West Africa, there is an island, and this island was isolated from the rest of Africa, although we find DNA from people from North and West Africa within this island. These people are called the Guanches, and they were a Berber tribe. And even that isolated group was found to have a matrilineal society. The Berber inhabitants of Gran Canaria Island had developed a matrilineal society by the time the Canary Islands and their people called Guanches were conquered by the Spanish. So prior to the Spanish getting there, they had already created a society that was matrilineal. The Tuareg, and of course, now we're still talking about very far away from Egypt, but they have similar things to the Egyptians. The Tuareg have a also a very similar thing where they're matrilineal. This is a well-known thing. And again, remember there's a book called by Bodwick T. Edward, The Similarities Between Ancient Egypt, Abyssinians, and the Ashanti Kingdoms. Three kingdoms he was very familiar with. And he brought up this very point. And he said, it seems, and by the way, he's not the first to say this, Ibn Battuta said this, a lot of people said this. It seems that the women in this area enjoy a higher status than the men. Now, of course, there's a very skewed way of thinking that they were having because, of course, they came from patriarchal societies. And so, even the slightest amount of freedoms for females would be seen as highly controversial in their societies. As we read, the Tuareg, sometimes spelled Tuareg in French or Tuareg in English, are a large Berber ethnic confederation found across several nations in North Africa, including Niger, Mali, and Algeria. The Tuareg are clan based and are still largely matrilineal. The Tuareg are Muslims, but mixed with a heavy dose of their pre existing beliefs, including matrilineal. Tuareg women enjoy high status within their society compared with their Arab counterparts and with other Berber tribes. Tuareg social status is transmitted through women, with residents often matrilocal. Most women could read and write, while most men were illiterate, concerning themselves mainly with herding livestock and other male activities. The livestock and other movable property were owned by the woman, whereas personal property is owned and inherited regardless of gender. In contrast to most other Muslim cultural groups, men wear veils, but women do not. This custom is discussed in more detail in the Tuareg article's clothing section, which mentions it may be the protection needed against the blowing sand while traveling the Sahara Desert. I know all I can do is restate the similarities over and over again, but I think I need to make a tight video where I sit down and list all the cultural concepts that exist in ancient Egypt, that exist everywhere else in Africa and almost nowhere else in the world. And then they exist one after the other. That's the weird part. Different subject fields. I'm talking about medicine, art, geography, all of these. No matter which subject you pick, you will find them religion. You will find them having nothing but similarities. Dancing, and of course, remember the Basenji dog that is found in ancient Egypt that comes from West Africa, which means that West Africans must have had communication. But this is why I made the West African documentary and why I made it about early West Africa before I made it about later West Africa, because it must be understood that West Africans were not stuck to West Africa, and it must be understood that West Africans are connected to Central Africa, which is connected to North Africa through Libya, which is connected to Egypt. All of these things must be understood if we are to go forward in any way, shape, or form with the history of Africa. Now, of course, I'm not claiming that West Africa has bigger ties. Obviously, I believe that they don't, because in West Africa there is a unique and, in my opinion, almost second compared to Egypt in Africa, second compared to any part of Africa outside of Egypt and Nubia, where they develop metals early, they develop all these mounds and all these things that are found all over the place, but they have unique things that exist inside of that region that just do not exist anywhere else. Things that happen so early, and because we don't have beautiful stories to come with it, it's difficult to tell their tales. All you can say is, yeah, they did some pretty cool stuff, and people really don't like you to sit down and list things. They want to hear a crafted story about, oh, the Tumalus resemble tortoises and blah, blah, blah. And when they used to sit around the fire, they would summon these great gods who would come across green with envy and blah, 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 blah. A much better way to present things, but ultimately you're going to get lied to because they want to appeal to your happy brain. So, as a final concept or comment, I will say this: take this with you. We represent a history that is so diverse and so strong that everyone else wants to claim it for their own. Do not disappoint the ancestors by making your life not as good as theirs. They broke completely out of nowhere and created some of the greatest civilizations on earth in a time when there should be nothing and information was scarce. Today, we are in an opportunity to do things that they could never have. Let's make the same leaps in the diaspora that they made long time ago. Thank you for watching.